Welcome to Digging Deeper through Mark. This is on Mark 2 and 3. And again, like I said last week, as the name suggests, this is really for those of you that are doing the reading plan with us through Mark and you want to go a little bit deeper. So I can't cover everything because there's so many awesome things in the chapters of Mark. But I'm just going to focus on about 3 things per week. So we're looking at Mark 2 and 3 this week. I've got a few things I want to point out to you. By the way, last week I had an allergy attack about 4 minutes in. I don't know if you realized it, but I was already committed at that point. So I made it through. I toughed it out. So hopefully we'll get through today without that happening. We'll see what happens. All right, here we go. Real quick, before we look at Mark 2 and 3, just a quick reminder. Why did Mark write the book to begin with? You remember last week what we talked about is that Mark was writing this in the context of a storm. So he was probably an eyewitness account of Peter, and he is recording this to encourage Christians in Rome who are being persecuted really strongly for their faith in Jesus. And additionally, it would hopefully be an apologetic, something that was making a defense for the gospel for people that were not Christians. That's really what Mark was after. He's writing it into a storm. And what we said last week, if you remember, is his purpose was pretty simple. He is trying to show who Jesus is and why Jesus came. Jesus is the authoritative and powerful Son of God who came to serve and die on a cross. That's ultimately what Mark's all about. The first half focuses more on who Jesus is. The second half focuses more on why he came. And the reason that's important is because anytime you read a book of the Bible, the author has a purpose. So everything that they include in their book goes back to that purpose. So everything we come across in Mark, we want to ask the question, what does this have to do with Mark's purpose? Why would he include this given his purpose in writing? All right, so that's what we're after. Here we go. Some of this stuff's going to be repetitive, but that's because Mark is repeating it to try to make a point. So that's what's cool about it is we're going to learn a lot by simply repeating a lot of the same things. Okay, so here we go. We're going to start in Mark 2, the very first story in Mark 2. This is the first thing I want to look at. This is in verses 1 through 12. We're not going to read the whole thing. We're just going to kind of recap it. This is a really crazy story. Now, before we look at it, I'll say this. There was one time at the gym that I was working out at. They were playing Sports Center, all right, on ESPN. And there were these kids gathered around the TV watching it because it was the top 10. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but they'll show the top 10 plays of that day or of that week. And they're really cool plays that people will make in sports. Now, I've seen it a million times, so I just kind of watch and go, oh, it's cool, great. I've seen this a million times. It doesn't really get me excited. But there were these kids that were watching. It was like they had never seen it before. I mean, they were cheering. They were yelling. They didn't care that everybody was watching them. They were so excited about these awesome plays that they're watching. It reminded me that sometimes when you see something so much, you can forget how amazing it is. And the same thing can happen with Jesus. Is maybe we hear these stories so many times and we hear about the gospel so many times that we just kind of go, yeah, I've heard that. I know that. I'm used to that. But that's not how we should read these stories. That's not how we should hear the gospel of what Jesus did for us. Every time we hear it, we should be excited and we should be blown away. And the same thing is true of this story. This story is crazy. We need to realize how crazy and incredible this story really is. So what's happening is so many people are excited to see Jesus that there's no room in this house. I mean, they're just crammed in this house trying to listen to Jesus and trying to have Jesus heal them of diseases and sicknesses and things like that. So what happens in this story, if you remember, if you've read it yet, it's crazy. The scene is that they're in this house, it's packed, it's crowded, there's no room, and these guys have a friend who is, he's paralyzed, and they can't get him in the house because it's so packed. So what they do is, they so badly want him to get with Jesus so he can get healed, that they go through the roof. All right, that's crazy. Picture if that would happen in a church service today. Someone was so desperate to get in there, they came through the roof. All right, that we would be like, what is happening? It would freak us out. But that's how much they wanted their friend to be with Jesus. Now, this is the cool thing. This is what it says. Let me find it. This is in verse 5. It says, when Jesus saw their faith, that was definitely an act of faith. He said to the paralytic, son, your sins are forgiven. Now, that's weird. Here's why that's weird. That's not what the guy was looking for. That's not what the friends were looking for. They were not asking for that, for his sins to be forgiven. They wanted him to be healed. So what is Jesus doing? Why would he say, yeah, your sins are forgiven, and not first address the physical problem of the guy being paralyzed. Right? If you're at a restaurant and you ask for something and they send you something you did not ask for, you send it back. So what's Jesus doing here? What's happening? Okay, well here's what's happening. If you read the story, he does end up healing the guy. He ends up healing him so the guy doesn't have to be paralyzed anymore. And the reason that he does so is he wants to show his power, and he actually wants to back up what he said. Because only God can forgive sins. Only God can ultimately forgive someone of their sins. So by eventually healing him, he's showing, hey, I have the power of God. I am God. So I'm able to forgive sins. He's backing up what he's claiming to be able to do. But why does he start with forgiving sins? Right? Well, here's how I would say it, is that sometimes in life, right, I want to see how I said this, we think that what we need is actually not the thing that we need the most. So the thing that we think that we need is not actually what we need the most. So here's the reality. What the Bible teaches is this, is that our greatest problem is not that we need more money, or we need popularity, or we just need people to understand us, or we need this group to accept us, or we need to just be comfortable, or whatever. You can fill in the blank with whatever one. We just need this product, whatever. The Bible says, no, actually, that's not your number one problem. Your number one problem is that you were born a sinner, and that one day you're going to have to stand before a holy God. That's your number one problem. So what Jesus is saying is that, hey, I came to fix that problem. Yes, I care about the physical. Ultimately, I'm going to renew all things that are broken physically. But your number one need is you need to be made right with a holy God. So he is saying from chapter 2, from the beginning of Mark, Jesus is saying, hey, I came to take care of your greatest need. Your greatest need is actually not physical. Your greatest need is spiritual. And I came to take care of it so that one day I'm going to die on a cross. And for those that have faith in me, I'm going to forgive them fully of their sins so that when they stand before a holy God, he is going to accept them and delight in them as if they are his own children. And the same thing's true for you and me today. That's my greatest need. That's your greatest need. So the question is this: what do you believe your greatest need is? What Jesus is saying is that your greatest need is the gospel. Your greatest need is the good news of forgiveness through him. Wherever you're at today, wherever I'm at today, that is our greatest need. That's the number one thing that we need today. And that's what he's saying. So what do you think is your greatest need? Now, religious leaders hated that because he's claiming to be God. He's claiming to forgive sins. Ultimately, that's going to be why they kill him. This is where that's going to lead eventually. All right, so that's the first thing. Greatest need is the gospel. Number 2, this is kind of going off of that. This is in verse 13. It's the very next story. Once again, Jesus is calling some disciples to follow him. So he looks at Levi. He's a tax collector, not a good guy. The people would have rejected him. And he says, follow me. He calls this guy that nobody else would have called. All right. Now, he ends up going to hang out with him. And all these other sinners and tax collectors, these would have been people that were rejected by society and rejected by the religious leaders of that day. Jesus is hanging out with them. Okay, he's not affirming their sin, but he is loving the sinner. And they see that, and they don't like it, these religious leaders. So they get mad at him. And then this is what Jesus, they're like, hey, why is he hanging out with these sinners? And then this is what Jesus says. Verse 17, this is an awesome verse. This is one of the best verses in Mark. When Jesus heard that, he said to them, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. Right? So there's 2 things here. One is challenging. One gives us a lot of hope. The challenging thing is this, is that we live in a society where it's so easy to look at other people's problems, but not to really look at ourselves. It's very easy to do that, to call out other people's problems, to blame them, but to not look at ourselves. And that's ultimately what the religious leaders are doing, is they can see other people's sin, but they have a really hard time seeing their own sin. That's called pride. They're blinded to their own sin, but they can see it in somebody else. So where this should challenge us is we should go, wait, do I know how sick I really am? Do I know that I need a doctor? Or do I think that I'm actually great because I'm comparing myself to other people? That's the challenge. The hope is this. Okay, what Jesus is saying is that the worst place to be is to be sick but to not know it. But if you know that you're sick, the greatest news ever is to know that there is a doctor that can help you get healed. And to the people that know that they're sick, which all of us are sick, it's just a matter of if we know we're sick spiritually, Jesus is saying, hey, I am the good doctor that can heal you of your sin. So think about this. Think about the hope that that can bring. That Jesus has the power and the compassion to forgive and to heal anybody, no matter how far they are from God, no matter what they've done, that he can forgive and heal everything in your life. He can change everything in your life and even in the people's lives that you think they're so far from God that they have no hope. Think about how hopeful that is, that Jesus has compassion and he came to forgive and change and heal even the worst of us. So if you're sitting there today and you've got some sin in your life that you don't even want to tell anyone about, then I would encourage you to bring that out because Jesus wants to heal that and to forgive that. Is there someone maybe even in your path that you might be able to represent the love of Christ to? That you might think, man, I don't think they could ever get it. But maybe they will. All right, here's the last one. I'm running low on time. Okay, this is in Mark 3. We're going to fast forward. Verse 13 is where this starts. Now, we're going to recap. This is a little bit from last week. This is the last thing. Right before this, these crowds are following Jesus, so much so that they might even crush him. That's what verse 7 says. That this huge crowd is following them. And then, verse 9, it says that they had to give him a boat to get away from the crowd so he didn't get crushed. That's how much people are trying to follow him. Now, what he could have done is said, man, I'm going to make this crowd huge and gain this huge following. That's not what he did. He did something really crazy that we talked about a little bit last week. In verse 13, it says what he did is he calls 12 people to follow him closely. That's what he does. That's something so interesting because he could have these huge crowds. He says, no, I'm going to focus on these 12 people. He's after disciples. That's his entire focus, not on building crowds, but on building into people, on building disciples. Now, we would see this as such a failure today. We would look at him and go, what are you doing? That guy's a failure. He only has 12 people following him, right? He had more people following him the disciples would in turn impact, but he really is focusing on 12 people. We would see that as a failure, but his strategy was to walk closely with 12 guys, to teach them, to train them, and then to allow them to carry it on after he died. Now, did that work? Well, think about that. It absolutely worked because think about how many people globally have a relationship with Jesus. Now, here's kind of the way that I would say this. So far in Mark, I'm seeing three different types of people. I'm seeing the disciples who are humble, who weren't perfect, but they were humble and they followed him and they learned from him. I'm seeing the crowds, which mostly, generally speaking, the crowds seem to be they're interested because Jesus is interesting and he's doing really cool things, but they're not necessarily following him. Right? And then you have the religious leaders who pridefully reject him because they don't see their own need for him. So I want you to think about this. Which one of those three do you relate to the most today? Do you see yourself as a disciple who's humbly learning from Jesus? Do you see yourself as someone that's around Jesus in the crowds, but you're not really following him? Or do you see yourself, honestly, as maybe one of the religious people that you're blind to your own sense of need for him and you kind of look down on other people? That's what I'm seeing so far. Okay, now here's kind of the last thing is that for the disciples, and my prayer is that we would just continue to grow as disciples during the summer, is that Jesus' kingdom is so different than how this world works. He chooses people that nobody else would probably choose. He teaches them not to look at how everybody else is doing things, not to look at how everyone else is living, but instead to realize and to live as if they are a part of a different kingdom. They're under a different authority, and it's his authority. So my encouragement to you this summer as we continue through Mark is to think about that. Are you under his authority? Are you living as if you're a part of a different kingdom? Are you truly being with him so that then you can be sent out to make disciples just like him? All right, this is Mark 2 and 3. So much there. It's awesome. If you have any questions, please let us know. We'll be back next week. We're going to look at Mark 4 next week. All right, thanks for watching. Have a great week and enjoy digging into Mark.